Hello. So today I want to talk about some books that are obviously nonfiction and that are a little bit less popular, don't get talked about much, kind of hidden away, or were once popular and have since been lost in the annals of time. These kinds of books you wouldn't ordinarily see being talked about, basically, that are nonfiction. The first one is this book called Thinking Strategically, The Competitive Edge in Business, Politics, and Everyday Life. Now, this book, I think, was once popular. It says international bestseller, but it doesn't get talked about much today, in part because I think there is a book called The Art of Strategy, which is similar to this book, but that book, I think, is a worse version of this book. The reason why I like this book and why I think it's a hidden gem is because it talks about the core elements of strategy and how it applies to you as a person. So, for example, anticipating your opponent's responses. This is something that most people probably don't do intuitively. We might think about how someone might react to something, but it's different to consider how someone might react to something deliberately, like thinking about it on a conscious level, especially when the thing that you're thinking about is a strategy. Another thing might be predictability, thinking about how predictable you are in your responses towards things. The book really does a great job of kind of getting you into the psychological space of thinking strategically, and that's why it's on this list. In the same vein of the previous book is the Introduction to Decision Theory. And the reason why this is on here is because it's a good complement to the previous book, and this book I've never seen anybody really talk about this book. I've seen it maybe once on Bookstagram in the last 5 years that I've been doing it. And the reason why it's on here is because it will teach you how to do what the previous book did, but this time incorporate some math into it. It will teach you how to operationalize your decision making. So basically assigning numbers to things. The book does use a little bit of statistics. It's very basic. It's just rudimentary, like summing and multiplication of probabilities. It's nothing advanced. And it's a gem. It's a book that I would recommend reading if you're going to read the previous book. But if you're also just interested in decision theory, this is a great introduction as well. It's definitely a gem that's worth reading. Now, this next one is The Principles of Geology by Charles Lyell. This book is on here because as I was reading you might have been familiar with my previous videos, I was reading a biography of Charles Darwin, and the author points out a lot, like quite a bit, that this book has a lot of the ideas of Darwin inside of it, and Darwin doesn't give credit to it. And the ideas inside this book are basically that change happens over time and that the natural forces of the world shape the environment we're in. Now, I never heard of this book. I've been buying books every week for the last 15 years, and I only heard of this book recently, and I would have loved if somebody would have showed me this book earlier. That's why it's on this list. I haven't read it yet, but I've read samples of it, and it's written pretty nice. It's written fancifully. I'd probably recommend reading a geology textbook beside it, because obviously it's going to be out of date. But yeah, it's definitely a gem that you won't see talking about a lot within Bookstagram or BookTube. This book, The Sense of Style by Steven Pinker, is on here because although this might be a little bit of a more popular book, compared to other books, I don't know, I can't think of any off the top of my head, but this book is probably one of the least talked about Steven Pinker books, or one of the fewer talked about Steven Pinker books. And it was a book that had a good impact on me. It's a pretty important writing book. The book is about writing, right? And a lot of the things that I do when I'm writing, I actually got from this book, and the things he talks about aren't necessarily things you'll find in grammar books either. Like it is a book about style. So, for example, how many abstract nouns you use inside of a sentence can impact the cognitive load on the reader. It's not something you would find inside of a grammar textbook. Another one might be the uses of like connecting words or being words, so like is or that. If you put too many of those into a sentence, the result might be that your sentence no longer is concrete and full of imagery, right? Which is a bad thing. just ideas like this inside this book are the reason why it's on this list. And I don't really see people talk about this book that much. This book is Financial Accounting in an Economic Context by Jamie Pratt. Now, this is probably the best financial accounting textbook you're going to get. And the reason why it's on this list is not because I think people have a deep interest into financial accounting, but people do have a deep interest into investing. And I think the best way to go about investments is by reading financial reports. And in order to have the skill set to read financial reports, you need financial accounting. So that's why this book is here. And I think it's probably the best book I've come across for financial accounting. If you're looking for something a little bit shorter, there's The Interpretation of Financial Statements by Mary Buffett and David Clark. I highly recommend that book. But if you're looking for something more robust and a little bit more thorough, then I would highly recommend this book. Nobody talks about it, in part because it's a textbook, right? People aren't going to talk about textbooks on Bookstagram or BookTube. But also because people don't really care about financial accounting, they just care about making returns from investing. Now, this book, Darwin's Dangerous Idea by Daniel Dennett, is actually a famous book, but I noticed it hasn't been read as much recently, in part because it was published, I think, in the 80s or 90s. It's a pretty old book. But the ideas inside this book are basically, to put it in brief, questioning what humans are and what the meaning of life is. I believe evolution and the meaning of life is in the subheader, in the context of natural selection, right? So what are the consequences of a Darwinian worldview, or you could largely say naturalism, on the everyday things we think about in life? So yeah, meaning, work, the future, so on and so forth. Kind of places us in... I think the aim of the book is to contextualize humans within the confines of physics and determinism and so on and so forth. This book, The Anatomy of Melancholy. Now, I haven't read this book yet, but it is a behemoth of a book. The font is probably size 10. It is a pretty big book, and it's about melancholy, obviously, but it's like a systematic treatise on melancholy. It's probably the best book ever published on melancholy. And it is a fantastic book. Obviously, because it's so big, you're not going to see a lot of people recommend it or talk about it. But amongst heavy-duty nonfiction readers, I'll say, this book is a bit more popular. But amongst the general readers of books, it's not that well known. And yeah, it's such a cool book. It talks about the causes of melancholy, whether it be economic, psychological, or social, or whatever. The different ideas about the nature of melancholy, how melancholy interacts with different elements of your mind, right? Whether melancholy should be something that's avoided or pursued. Just so much analysis about one specific thing, which is melancholy, which I think is a really cool approach to a book. That's what makes it interesting. This next book, The Uses of Enchantment, I have not seen anybody talk about at all. Again, not that I can remember. And I've only seen this in one bookstore my entire life. So yeah, it's a bit of a rare book, I guess. And I like the ideas inside of it. So the ideas are kind of like what people like to read mythology, and when they read mythology, they like to have psychological analysis of mythology. Think about that, like Joseph Campbell, like that, or like Jung, but with enchantment. So basically, this person takes a psychoanalysis framework and applies it to things like fairy tales, witches, or spells, or things like that. It kind of provides a secular meaning to these fictional stories, which is kind of fun. John Searle's Speech Acts. So the reason why this is on here is because I don't see people talk about philosophy of language books often, but this book is particularly important because it talks about the nature of meaning. And one of the theories of meaning that he has is that the meaning of words actually comes from outside of words. Speech acts, right? Speaking is an act. One of the famous examples he always gave during his lectures was that if I declare somebody to be married, if I say John and Jane are not married, the meaning there is different than if a priest or a judge said it, right? The meaning changes depending on the physical features of the environment, right? Whether it's a judge or just me, right? It's a speech act. There's an act to it. And he says the same thing about like apologies, how the apology is said, for example, changes its meaning if you say it in like an aggressive way or if you say it in like a sincere way. I think he calls them sincerity conditions actually in the book. Yeah, it's a pretty good book, and I think it should be read more often, given that people who read nonfiction tend to play the language games. Like they try to get really, really specific meanings for words when they're reading it. Yeah, it's a pretty important book. This last one is We Are Data, and this is a book that I rarely see spoken about, and it is also a quite interesting book that should be worth reading for most people in modern times. It talks about having this notion of the self, right? Like in traditional philosophy, we have this notion of the self. And we always look internally when we're defining this notion of self. But what the authors do is they look externally. So for example, let's say you're trying to build a notion of a self. Well, there's an algorithmic notion of who you are, right? So if we go to the NSA, the NSA might have a very specific notion of who your self is. If we go to your search history, that's a very specific notion of what your self is. It's kind of looking at all these big data sets that are out there that have elements of your personhood into them that can be put together to create a algorithmic notion of who you are as a person, and taking that notion very seriously, right? It's basically like a modern approach to defining selfhood. So those are some of the books that I think are not talked about a lot, but are nonetheless important, and of course are nonfiction. If you have any other books like this, I'd be interested in hearing about them. I like to, especially like the book like Melancholy, I like really, really esoteric nonfiction books that aren't quite popular because they're so dense, but also just nonfiction books that maybe fell out of the mainstream that are still really good. If you have any recommendations on those, I would love to hear about them. But with that being said, bye-bye.